So welcome. What we're going to talk about today is a Western history of mental health. Um, the world's history is spectacularly long and spectacularly diverse. And so it's really important when we talk about history to frame whose perspective we're talking about it from. I am Métis, and that means a whole host of things, but it also, one of the things that it means is that I have a somewhat Indigenous perspective and a somewhat Western European perspective. So often I go back and forth between both. If you find that confusing, as lots do, it's not you, it's me. So feel free to clarify if there's a point where you need me to sort out where I'm coming from. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about a Western European or Canadian history of mental health. Because it's always important to figure out where we're coming from before we decide where we're going. So, for much of our history, mentally ill or challenged people with mental challenges have been treated extremely poorly in our society. For example, in medieval times, abnormal behaviors were viewed as a sign that someone was possessed by demons. If they were considered to be possessed, there were several forms of treatment to release spirits from the individual. The most common treatment was exorcism. This would often be conducted by priests or other religious figures. There would be incantations and prayers said over the person's body, and she or he may have been given some medicinal drinks. The medicine often applied to people with mental illness or difference in those times. The medicine would have been enough to kill you on its own. Another form of treatment for extreme cases of difference and sometimes mental illness was something called trephining. And that's the image that you see on the screen right now. Trephining was where they would drill a small hole in the skull because it was believed that bad spirits were trapped inside the skull, and this was a way to release them. Most people who were treated by trephining died, obviously. Surgery in any era is difficult, but brain surgery in a medieval time is something in and of itself. Other practices that were common in these times were execution, imprisonment, and excommunication, or being set out from society, left homeless, and left to beg on the streets for sort of their well-being. Generally speaking, most people who exhibited strange behavior and difference of any kind were highly misunderstood and treated quite cruelly. The prevailing theory of psychopathology in early history was the idea that it was a demon or an evil spirit. And because people feared demons and feared evil and feared, frankly, anything that they didn't understand, the people themselves were treated as dangerous. What else do I know? Around 2700 BC, so before the Common Era, Chinese medicine's concept of complementary positive and negative bodily forces, yin and yang, attributed mental illness to an imbalance between these forces. And so often someone would be prescribed exercises or a more balanced life so that they could return to what would be considered a more normal state. And if we move on to 1400s or 1600s AD, or Anno Domini in the current age, the common belief was still that this was evil or evil spirits or demons, except for we sort of shifted the blame. Prior to this, it was thought that evil spirits and demons entered the body without your permission. But in the 1400s, we began to shift the blame to the people themselves, saying that they invited evil in. Now, this is where you would see the witch trials of Salem. The people who were considered evil were often women, because women were in charge of the healthcare at that time. And so if they were too successful in taking care of their families and communities, they would be considered, obviously, a challenge for the church. And so witches were tried and condemned by courts and often burned at the stake. Worldwide, it's estimated that tens of thousands of mentally ill people were killed after being accused of being witches or under the influence of witchcraft. And that's not even the ones who were not exhibiting signs of mental illness, just exhibiting signs of difference or strength. What I always find interesting, to take us back a step, is the beginning of hysteria. Mesopotamian and Egypt papyri from 1900 BC describe women suffering from mental illness resulting from a wandering uterus, and this was later named hysteria by the Greeks. They believed that the uterus could come dislodged and reattached to parts of the body like the liver or the chest cavity, which would prevent the proper functioning of those areas of the body and create pain for the women involved. As a result, they also employed somatogenic treatment of strong smelling substances to guide the uterus back to its proper location. Pleasant odors to lure and unpleasant odors to push away. And the reason that I bring this up is because as we move through history, and in Western Europe, men take dominance over women fairly early in history. And hysteria is something that women are charged with for a very, very long time, anytime they exhibit any difference. So, important to note that the Greeks were some of the first to sort of move away from the thought of evil and demons. Around 400 BC, Hippocrates, who is someone you might know or might relate to the Hippocratic Oath. If you've watched any medical dramas on TV, they talk about the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath of doctors to do no harm. And it comes from Hippocrates. So he attempted to separate superstition and religion from medicine by sort of systematizing or creating an understanding of the belief that all physical deficiencies, mental and physical, were due to an excess in one of the 4 essential body fluids. So, for example, someone who was too temperamental suffered from too much blood, and the answer to that would obviously be bloodletting through like poking a hole in them so they bleed, or using leeches to draw the blood out. Hippocrates classified mental illness into one of 4 categories. There was epilepsy, mania, melancholy, and brain fever. And he was very instrumental in trying to shift the idea of shame away from mental illness. He believed that mentally ill people were not responsible for their behavior. And at this time, mentally ill individuals were cared for at home by family members, and the state sort of shared no responsibility for their welfare. So just to shift back in history, and most of what I talk about comes from North America from here on in. So beginning in around the 13th century, the mentally ill and the different, those who did things in a way that was different than what was expected by the church, began to be persecuted as witches and possessed. And we know that the height of the witch hunts during the 15th to 17th centuries, hundreds of thousands of women were burned at the stake or drowned or buried alive. Yeah, it's just interesting. Oops, I went too far. So as we progress in history and we start to understand that it's not about evil necessarily, we started to create places where the state could look after people who were different. So anyone who was considered odd or unusual was placed into an asylum. So asylums were really created at first as for the specific purpose of housing people with psychological disorders. But the focus was ostracizing them from society rather than treating their disorders. So the point was that we needed to protect the bigger, broader social group and just separate these people. And since we didn't understand mental illness at the time, there really was no treatment. So often, how these people were cared for actually didn't really matter, and they would be kept in windowless dungeons, beaten, often chained to their beds, and had little or no contact with the people taking care of them, treated essentially like animals. And this was the general understanding. The belief at the time was that mentally ill people didn't have the capacity to reason and they couldn't control themselves. They were capable of violence without provocation and didn't have the same sensitivity to pain or temperature, and that they could live in miserable conditions without complaint. So they were ruled by fear. You know, people treated them by dominating them. So one of the first people to change conditions in institutions like this was Philip Pinel. In the late 1700s, he was a French physician. You don't need to remember this name, by the way. I like to have anchors of names and places to help me sort of document how and where things changed. So it was around the late 1700s, and this particular image is an image of Frank Pinel on the left, a gentleman, a doctor, asking for the chains to be removed from the patients. He suggested that it was important to talk to people, and to listen for people and to treat them like humans above all else. And so that made a huge difference slowly in how we created and sort of staffed institutions. The next person that comes to mind when I talk about the history is Dorothea Dix. So Dorothea Dix is 19th century, and that means 1800s. She was really sort of aghast at what was happening in institutions. She was a retired school teacher and just sort of discovered the negligence of the conditions that mentally ill people were being kept in. And she advocated for the beginning of what's now known as a state hospital. So a hospital that's not run by private citizens, but that's run by the state and with standards. She helped establish over 30 institutions in the United States and Canada. And by the late 19th century, sort of the moral treatment that came from Pinnell. So Pinnell's idea was, let's stop treating them like animals. Like, we have a moral obligation to treat them like humans. And she moved it to more of an idea of mental hygiene. Like, there is a way that we take care of mentally ill people. And ill people in general. Yeah. So the important thing for Dorothea Dix is she sort of ushered in a new age of a medical approach to mental illness. So now we're in the early 1900s, 20th century, and the common approach, despite Pinnell's changes and Dorothea Dixon's changes, what the general asylum looks like is kind of the image you see here: extreme overcrowding, very little treatment, and people would be lost. They would stay there for a very long time. At Willard Psychiatric Center in New York, for example, one treatment was to submerge patients in cold baths for long periods of time. Electroshock treatment was also used, and the way that the treatment was administered often resulted in actually a fractured spine for the patients. In 1943, doctors at Willard, the hospital I just mentioned, administered 1,443 shock treatments. Now, electroshock is still used today, but it's called electroconvulsive treatment, and there are safeguards in place. It's done under anesthesia, and bodies are controlled from reacting to it in an adverse way. It's generally used to produce kind of a seizure reset for the electrical system of the body. And there's still controversy over how effective it really is. But to move on from that, the wards themselves in the late 19th, early 20th century were often unheated. So in the wintertime, they become so cold that a glass of water would freeze on a bedstand. And this particular hospital, Willard's, was still in operation until 1995. So it's important to understand that conditions like what you're looking at in this photo or worse were actually commonplace until well into the 20th century. Sorry. 19th and 20th century, though, did see some pretty big advances in psychology. So we have two major advances and major theories that come out of the 19th and 20th century that completely change the way that we look at and think about thoughts in the brain and mental states. The first is Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic theory. We make fun of Freud a lot because he had some pretty out there ideas, but we have Freud to thank for being the first real psychologist to sort of advocate for people, for listening to people and hearing them out, and talk therapy. All of this comes from Freud and psychodynamic theory that he established as a practitioner. The other one is John B. Watson, and his theory is behaviorism. Watson believed that we can't really believe anything that people say because they lie. So we have to watch what they do, and we can essentially train people. And we call this classic conditioning, and it actually became famous by someone, a Russian physiologist called Pavlov. We often refer to Pavlov's dog when we're talking about how easy it is to train people and animals. So these two gentlemen actually really, really sort of set the world on a new path in terms of the way that we study and talk about and think about mental illness. So fast forward a little bit to about post-World War II, and people realize that we have a lot of theories and ideas about mental disorders and mental illness, but we don't, there's nowhere to go, like no encyclopedia or volume of knowledge that we can sort of refer to. And so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was created. This manual is still around. Every couple, 5 years or so, psychologists get together, they assess what's in the manual and what's going on in the world and how treatment has changed, and they add and change and edit what is in there. We are currently on the DSM-6. I know I have a picture of 5 up there, but we currently use DSM-6. Yeah, and so now we finally have a manual to consult. Yeah, so I guess one more thing you need to know is early editions of the DSM describe mental disorders in terms of reactions, sort of people responding to their environment and biological factors. Fortunately, around 1980, we see some major changes in the DSM that shift the focus to potential etiological causes of issues or genetic causes of issues, biological causes of issues. And even where we are now in DSM-6, we still see that, or we still have this understanding that mental differences are based on genes and DNA and also environment and how people are raised and biological factors as well. And finally, around the 1950s, we start to see some medicines, some medications introduced. And interestingly enough, what the introduction of medication meant, of antipsychotic medication, was that we could close institutions. So in the 1970s, there was this huge, huge movement to deinstitutionalize mental health and get people out of institutions back into homes with their families and people who love them. Unfortunately, what happened is a shift to less institutions, less institutionalization, but less hands-on care as well for a lot of mental health issues. And one of the stats that we face today is that the homeless population in our cities is a large chunk of the homeless population is made up of people with mental illness. Yeah. So the field of psychotherapy, with its early roots in Freud's psychodynamic theory, saw some new developments. In particular, there's a psychologist named Albert Ellis and an American psychiatrist named Aaron Beck. And they began adopting treatment approaches aimed at addressing different cognitions and emotions underlying mental disorders. So when you combine this sort of mental emotional approach with the principles of behaviorism, it sort of led to the eventual development of cognitive behavior therapy, which is really the most common approach now. Um, it's what we consider kind of the gold standard of therapy in modern times. And this has had a huge impact on the way that we treat and work with people who are struggling with any sort of mental difference at all. So today there are community mental health centers across the nation. They're often in neighborhoods, near homes, easy to access. But unfortunately, part of what happened, what occurred with deinstitutionalization, was that people who were released from institutions to go into the newly created centers, but our systems are not set up super effectively. Centers were kind of underfunded. Mental illness and mental health actually has chronically been underfunded in society. And staff often was not trained to handle severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia. And there was often very high staff burnout. No provision was made for the other services that people needed, like housing and food and job training. And without all of these supports, those people who were released in the shift, in the deinstitutionalization, often ended up homeless. So as I said, a large portion of our homeless population is or face mental illness. Statistics from about 2015, 2016 show that 26% of homeless adults living in shelters live with mental illness, which is a ridiculously high number. Another group of the mentally ill population is involved in the correction system. According to a 2006 report, approximately 705,000 mentally ill adults were incarcerated in our prison system, and another 78,000 were incarcerated in the federal system. And probably close to 500,000 are in local jails. People who face mental illness or live with mental illness are overrepresented in parole and probation hearings at rates probably 2 to 4 times the general population. And we don't have asylums anymore, but we do have regional psychiatric centers like the one in Saskatoon. Also in all types of hospitals, the emphasis in all types of hospitals, we have a psychiatric unit for short-term care. But in all of these places, the emphasis is on short-term stays, with the average length of stay being less than 2 weeks and often only several days. The Dubé Center is another one, another place in Saskatoon where psychiatric care is offered, but the waiting list to get in is just ridiculous. So part of this is due to the very high cost of psychiatric hospitalization, which can be anywhere between $800 to $1,000 per night. And insurance coverage often limits the length of time a person can be hospitalized for treatment. Usually individuals are only hospitalized if they're of imminent threat to themselves or others. So it really isn't about whether or not hospitalization could benefit the patient. It's more about, are they in crisis? So we have two types of treatment now for mental illness. There's inpatient and outpatient treatment centers. Inpatient treatment centers are the regional psych center, hospitals, places like Dubay, that are all sort of intended to be short-term. The psych center is a little bit more long-term, and there are long-term psychiatric care homes. There are addiction centers that have a sort of like a course of treatment that you move through and then you're released back into the public. And then there are also short-term wellness centers, almost like rehabilitation centers. Outpatient care looks like therapy, like counseling, like group therapy. Maybe it's meetings. It can be outpatient care, can be community support centers or information available within the community. It can also be helplines and crisis support. And we've seen a huge surge in the need for crisis support, even just based on what's going on with COVID. So to wrap this all up, following the abandonment of supernatural explanations and theories, and with the emergence of logical thought and experimental reasoning after the Middle Ages, the stage was sort of set for a transition to a humane method of treating mental illness. That shift led to the advent of modern theories of mental illness, dedicated classification systems, as well as theoretical approaches to treatment based on clinical evidence, and that's huge. Despite the progress, there are still ongoing public health concerns with respect to effectively implementing the most appropriate model of mental health care for society. Well, I'll say that in a minute. Sorry. These are themes that we have to look at. One of the most interesting things that I learned in my training for becoming a counselor was that therapists, psychologists do not actually have a standard for what it looks like to be healthy. We're really just focused on what it looks like to be different and to feel differently. And so I think one of the most important things that we need to work with young people like yourself on, or anyone who's interested in progress, is to establish a baseline for what mental health actually looks like. Okay. So I will save that video in the, I'll put it back in the announcement. So I'm just going to check. Yes. So one of the things that Megan brought up in the chat is that, as you can see on the Queen's Gambit, which I haven't watched yet, I heard is spectacular. They really emphasize the use of medication, and medication itself can lead to mental illness and addiction. The medications that we use as antipsychotics are usually a last resort, and can be very dangerous if left sort of unchecked and unmanaged. That's a great point, Riley. Sorry, I'm reading the comments as I go. So Riley says, I feel like some of the stuff I have kind of defines who I am in a good way, if that makes sense. And I absolutely think that it does make sense. I think all too often we're really focused on everyone being the same, feeling the same, doing the same. And for the rest of this unit, we will talk about what mental health looks and feels like. And it's not being the same. It's not doing things exactly the same as everyone else. It's, I would say, in my understanding, it's more like balance and a sense of well-being. It's really important that you have a sense of calm and peace. And if you, however you achieve that, well, I guess there are limits on however you achieve it, but most ways, as long as you can find a sense of balance and peace and it's not harming anyone else, then I think you're well on your way to mental health. So I'm just sort of watching for any other questions. If you have any questions about the weekly announcement, feel free to pop them in, or homework that you've done. It's important to know as we move into this new unit that you have to complete the brain test before lots of this unit will open up for you. So if you haven't done that yet, go do it. You get 2 shots at it, and I think that it's valued at less than 1% of your overall mark. It's really just there to help you study, help you highlight the important. I kind of got, sorry, I kind of got lost there. I went in and out. Um, Not 100% sure what happened to me, but I'm back. So, um, if you have any questions, post them in the chat. I lost the other chat. Looks like Stephanie just got back to, yeah, I don't know what just happened there. It all just went weird for a second. Don't worry about it, Stephanie. It may have been my fault. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so that's all I have for today. As I said, try to follow as best you can the plan that I set out for you for the week. Make absolutely sure that you have finished the assignments from the last unit. Everything that we do builds on that brain knowledge, which is why I focused on that test for you. Get the test done, or you won't be able to open the initial assignments in Unit 2. And that's it. Oh yes. So Stephanie, some of the Unit 2 folder will just be going up today. And I saw that you finished the test, so it should all be there. But I will double check and make sure that it all is loading properly. If it isn't, if you get to a point where on the calendar it says you should be doing something that you don't have access to, then don't hesitate to drop me an email. And that goes for anyone. I know some of you like to bounce around and do things in your own order. And for the most part, that's okay. There is a paper due this week as well. It's a short one, but there is a rubric. And it's really just about sort of, it's about, I want to see how you share your thoughts in writing. That's kind of the really important thing for me right there. So try not to go over 2 pages in that paper. Okay, the question, Riley, I'm just double checking to make sure that you have everything in. Yep, Riley, you're all good. So there is an assignment for this PowerPoint. As soon as I close the recording, it takes about 20 minutes for it to do whatever it needs to do to be shareable. And once it is, I will drop this video into the content folder, sort of close to or with the assignment for History of Mental Health. It's really just a couple of questions. It shouldn't take you very long to complete this assignment at all. It's just a little application of theory so that we build more pathways in your brain for this information. And I will see you Wednesday at 1 o'clock. So get back into the announcement. Do your Mindful Monday. Feel free to do that video and walk through that understanding as often as you want. I do a breath like that multiple times a day. Good. I'm glad you enjoyed. So again, watch your Mindful Monday video. Review this week's discussion post. I'm really excited to see your thoughts and ideas and the way you interact with this particular discussion. And remember that discussions form a very large part of your mark. So you have your initial post, which has to be completed before Wednesday. And then I want you to comment on 3 of your classmates by expanding or bringing something else to their conversation. Don't forget to include your sources. Do the history of mental health. And yeah, that's great. Lots to do this week. So I am going to check out, stop the recording, and I hope you have a spectacular rest of your Monday.